we're about the halfway point here, and lots of different things that we've heard out here, lots of good ideas, and there's many outcomes I think that we could foresee as being possible from this first meeting as such. And what we'd like to do to line things up a little bit for our final session, our consensus building, is to ask each one of you to use these cards that are on your table here and get 100% participation in this, and write down on that card something that would be a very specific recommendation. Okay, so again, using the question cards, please provide specific recommendations about what every music student should know about the risks specific to learning and performing music. And as an example, we might say, you might write something like, as a music student, you will be at increased risk for hearing loss. Okay, so something like that. You don't have to do it now, but and you're not limited to one card and one thought here. Okay, but we'd like to get those turned in by the end of the day down at our table there, and then we're going to use that as a basis for some of our consensus building and discussion tomorrow. And we have Mark, maybe you have a couple comments about what we're trying to do here.
I'd like to just begin by saying it's an honor to be a part of this exciting group and to learn so much from all the experts and all the different work groups. And look forward to working with you and your feedback in person and on the cards to try to come up with consensus on really what we want the music students to know about health that's specific to musicians by the time they graduate.
I'm Kathy Hammond, and I too am very honored to participate in this. I had a discussion with somebody a while ago about programs that are already in place at various schools, and if you have a program, a wellness class or whatever, that you're already doing at your institution, I'd love to meet with you about it sometime, maybe between the afternoon session and dinner, like say 5:30. Just meet out in the lobby area there. I have a copy of my syllabus and maybe some of my lectures that people would like to look at. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, that gave me your syllabus a while ago. That's a very interesting syllabus, and we could maybe all improve our current courses and make it easier to institute courses at other facilities too. So if you'd like to join us about 5:30 out there, that'd be great.
Good morning. Now for something completely different, as they say in British television. I'm Dr. Meinke. I'm a member of PAMA, have been for about 10 years now. And I have the honor, I guess it's an honor, of being the chairman of the PAMA Standards and Guidelines Committee. So the reason this is something completely different is I'm not talking about anything that has to do with music or health. I am talking about how you get, we've heard now from 3 of the work groups, they've provided a whole plethora of context and made some specific recommendations. I'm here to talk about how do you get from a recommendation from an expert to a standard or guideline that's accepted in an organization. And I'm presuming that I'm here to do that because the goal maybe of this group is to achieve that at some point. And before I get to my slides, I'm going to tell you about an experience I had that is kind of related. It's an illustration. In 1992, I was made the administrative physician of the Toyota plant in Georgetown, Kentucky. And my job was primarily to make sure that the plant was in compliance with OSHA standards. And the very first standard they put in my hand was the standard on bloodborne pathogens, because they'd had an accident in one of their buildings where a forklift actually tipped over. and the driver had injured his ankle and produced a large pool of blood in the plant, which was not cleaned up and was promptly run through by several other vehicles, and so the blood was spread all over the plant. And they were in a swivet because they wanted to know, were they in compliance with, was there a problem with the OSHA standard on bloodborne pathogens? It took me about 2 days to decipher the OSHA standard on bloodborne pathogens, and my initial report to them was, well, technically, you're in compliance. You don't have to be in compliance with this standard because it wasn't written for you. It was written for hospitals and nursing homes and laboratories, institutions that routinely handle body fluids. On the other hand, you're not in compliance with the general safety standards of OSHA because this is a health hazard and you have to do something about it. So they promptly put it back in my hands and said, okay, so write us a human resources policy about it. It took me about 3 weeks of thinking about it and thinking about the way the plant was run and the system and who would have to be responsible for taking care of these things, partly because if you were made responsible by the company for cleaning up body fluids, that brought you under the OSHA standard because it now became a written down duty of that position. And I ended up picking what I thought was the most efficient, the most cost-effective way to achieve this goal, having any of these fluids spread around the plant. And I wrote that up in their standard format, and I presented it to them. And they said, great, now sell it. And in the course of the next 3 years, I rewrote this policy 6 times because one group of stakeholders or the other had a complaint about it. No, we don't want to do the cleanup. No, we don't want to have our people trained. No, I rewrote this standard 6 times. In 1995, we had a change of human resources manager. And I said to him, you know, we've been around the block on this. We've tried several different ways to do it, and we're still sitting here 3 years later, and we don't have this in. He said, show me what you originally wrote. Within 3 months, they had adopted word for word what I had originally wrote. The point of that is it's hard to go from a recommendation, no matter how good the experts are, no matter how passionately you believe that this is the right thing to do, to having those ideas adopted by an entire organization, because that may not be their priority. Those 3 years were not wasted years. They were years in which I was talking with the various stakeholders and saying, you know, here's why I did this, because you can't train everybody in the plant to do this. You can train them about part of it so that they know not to start spreading things around if they're the only people there, but you have to direct them then to find somebody who's trained to clean it up. And no, we people in the health areas can't do it because we're tied there, because if somebody's injured, we got to take care of them. That's our priority. So what was going on in those 3 years is I was giving my rationale. The managers of the various departments were thinking about that and ultimately came to the same conclusion, but they had to go through that thinking process themselves. So when we ultimately did adopt that policy, then it was because the entire plant really did accept it. There were very few people that ultimately didn't understand why we had to have that policy. And that's sort of the position that we're in here in this group, is we're passionate about, we think these things need to be part of a curriculum and part of the standard. It's not clear to me that we represent the entire organization. As a matter of fact, Chris gave me a copy of the handbook for NAMS, and it mentions health only twice that I can find. And all it talks about is performance injury and getting people to experts or knowledgeable people about how to take care of that and prevent it. And the only other pertinent area is there is a brief section for institutions about equipment safety. There is nothing about hearing protection, which in most industries would be considered a safety issue. So having read that, I do believe there are deficiencies in the National Association of Music Schools guidelines that should be fixed. But you know, the process of getting them to adopt that may be more difficult than we're all hoping. And part of the point of my telling you that little story was I had done all the thinking in a month or two and came up with the policy, which was the one that we ultimately developed. So the work of those 3 years was to bring everybody else along, and that can be difficult. So the rest of my talk is mostly about just some ideas I have about what are standards, what are guidelines, what are some aspects of organizations that you have to bear in mind when you're trying to get this done. And at the very end, a little bit about a method that I think might be, it's not a fully realized method, but some ideas that might start us off on that direction, in the direction of getting this actually standardized into music education. So the problem, sooner or later every organization finds itself in a situation where it needs a yardstick by which it can measure attitudes and behaviors that have raised significant controversy among its members. If that organization is very lucky, it will have anticipated a lot of that, and it will have already in place some standards and guidelines that will help them when those issues arise. If it's not so lucky, it's going to be scrambling to write those when there's a crisis, and so they will not give it the kind of thought that they might have to do. If they're really unlucky, those people that are causing the problem are going to develop their own standards and ram them down the throat of the organization to everybody's unhappiness except for those few people. And the solution out of a range of possible solutions, tyranny is a possible solution. You know, the emperor just says what's going to happen to complete anarchism, where nobody says anything and everything just flies off the handle. In our society, because of the way our country was constituted and our society was constituted, we favor one that arises out of the communal feeling of the membership, because we are a democracy or representative democracy. And one of the reasons that works better than some of these other methods is because if everybody is brought along to the same feeling about it, or almost everybody, I realize you can't get everybody, then you have a standard or a guideline that is actually followed, rather than you've adopted something but everybody ignores it, which can often happen in an organization. So I don't have an objection to this kind of solution. It's the one that the National Association of Music Schools has recommended in their guidelines, is that you should have standards and guidelines. That's pretty much all it says about it. It doesn't say what they ought to be or how you ought to arrive at them. So the challenge is, can we devise this yardstick so that it's fair and is actually followed, and that they actually function? Now, I have kind of a unique view of standards, and it's because I do systems analysis. Standards for me are expressions or statements that arise directly from the central passion of the organization and speak the mind of the membership. So that's actually two criteria for a standard. It has to address the central passion of the organization, and that means you have to know what that is. And it has to address it in a manner that actually does connect with the members. And so it has to really actually address basic attitudes, perceptions, beliefs, and or behaviors. General standards are what they say they are. They're general and very basic expressions, and to my way of thinking, only of the attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs held in common by the membership or the self-evident truths of the organization. That self-evident truth comes from a very famous document, the Declaration of Independence. And actually, if you look at the Second Continental Congress in 1776, it really produced three documents. It produced the Declaration of Independence, it produced the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And I would maintain that that second paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. And further on, everybody's entitled to the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are general standards for this fledgling country that was trying to build itself. And they felt these were self-evident truths to them, but they knew they weren't self-evident to the rest of the world. So they needed to be articulated, and that's what they did. Now, standards that address behavior we call ethical standards. The difference between general ethical standards that your religion might teach you or something like that is that for an organization, an ethical standard has to be a behavior that's linked to one of those general standards, those basic beliefs, attitudes, what have you. And so you have to be able to actually connect those in everybody's mind to one of those basic components. Ethical standards are interesting. They tend to come down in lists. And often the lists are thou shalt nots. And when they are thou shalt nots, they are often attached, that have attached to them, because if you don't, we're going to cut your hand off or something like that. But sometimes, and in my Continental Congress analogy, it's the Bill of Rights that is the ethical standards. And these are, you have the right to congregate, you have the right to speak your mind, you have the right to confront your accuser in a timely manner. That's an interesting way of writing a list of ethical standards because it doesn't require you to do a certain behavior. It just guarantees that you have the right to do that if you so choose. Even a very famous ethical standard list is in the Bible, and it's a list of blessings. It's blessed are the poor. To me, that is not saying, well, blessed are the poor. It's saying, be content to be poor. It's not, do not be ashamed to be poor. Blessed are the peacemakers. Well, yes, be a peacemaker. You will be rewarded if you do that. That's an interesting way to do it, but I don't think any organization needs to understand that you can do it either way or all three ways. And you can do all three in the same document. You can say, gee, these behaviors don't support our central idea. We don't think you ought to do them. And if you do them, there might be a consequence. We could also say, we think these behaviors really support what we're trying to do here. And if you do them, here are the rewards. Or you could say, you know, you can do this or not, but you have the right to do this if you want to. There are all kinds of other standards, which is where some of the confusion about this come. But my contention is that they always have to relate back to these general standards and ethical standards. You have to be able conceptually somehow to relate them. My examples of other kinds of standards are academic standards, which many schools have. The thing about academic standards is that they're about knowledge. Sometimes they're a minimum standard. What's the minimum amount of knowledge you have? But in many, many institutions, including schools of medicine, it's also about how can you ostentatiously display this knowledge so that my institution gets recognized. Which is why I don't believe, in part, why I don't believe that it's a general standard, and it needs to be related back to one of the general standards. Standards of conduct, to me, indicate that the organization has a code of conduct that may be different from the general code of conduct, like the military. And in the military, the code of conduct changes from depending on whether you're an officer or an enlisted man. There's still one for each group, but it's different. Physical standards are just what they say they are. You know, they're performance standards for sports people. And performance standards for artists are, you know better than I do. But they're specialized, but they still can be related back to the general standards, the basic ideas of the organization. Guidelines are a set of practical recommendations produced by individuals with known experience and expertise in a topic or procedure. And they come in all kinds of forms. When I was working at the auto plant, that's a very linear sort of operation. In fact, the raw materials came into the plant in the morning, and 250 cars left the plant by the end of the day. So that was an extremely linear process. And so it had a lot of standardized work. But that's not the only way you can do things. The forms can be rule books, recipes, formulae, parables or aphorisms, algorithms, flowcharts, standard procedures. In our medical department, the procedures were linear, but they were still linear enough that something like a flowchart would work. In a flowchart, you start with point A, you go to point B. At point B, there's a decision you have to make, but there's only one or two or possibly three outcomes from that decision, and then you start another flow chart from that point on. As long as you don't have too many of those, the flow chart is fine. If it starts to be too many decision points, or there are too many possible answers to one of the questions, it gets unwieldy and it doesn't work. You also have to understand that there's some blurring between standards and guidelines depending on who's using it. If I were to take a cookbook and make an apple strudel and followed the recipe directly, I would produce a passable apple strudel. If a pastry chef takes that same recipe and does whatever he does, he's going to end up with something that may be heaven on earth. The difference is that he brings to what he does knowledge and expertise. So he is using that recipe as a guideline. Maybe it's a little more humid today, so I'm going to decrease the amount of water I use. Maybe it's a bit cool today, I'm going to increase the temperature of the oven a little bit. If I don't know to do that because I'm not a pastry chef, maybe he just knows that from the feel of the dough in his fingers. So the same recipe, the thing you take out of the recipe book, for me is a standardized procedure. For him, it's just a guideline. So clearly there is some washover between the two. It depends on the situation. And you really can't make a decision about that unless you know what that situation is. Now about organizations, many types of organizations, business, governments, religions, educational institutions, we could go on and on. All of them have these same basic three components. They have a central founding idea. To go back to the Continental Congress, the founding idea was the idea that the individual has some rights that are inalienable and cannot be taken over by an organization, such as a government. Around that founding idea, there will be a set of other ideas that kind of go along with it. They're related. And those end up being your general standards. And then, and as I talked about before, the general standards for the Continental Congress were the Bill of Rights and, for the most part, and the Declaration of Independence. And then the third component is a scheme for distributing power within the organization, and that's clearly for the Continental Congress was the Constitution. Now understand that the Constitution also contains some important, what I would call important standards, one of them being the separation of church and state. That doesn't come in the Bill of Rights. That's built right into the Constitution. So again, there's some overlap. In larger organizations, they're likely to have split into divisions or sections, each of which, though, will have the same elements as the parent organization. The focus of these individual elements in the divisions may be slightly different, but they're always referable back to those same elements in the parent organization, or they won't work. Now, if you look at an organization, and we're talking about here an organization that has been in existence for 80 years or something like that, they vary widely in how much they've published, but if they've been around that long, they'll have published a lot of stuff. Bylaws, mission statements, position papers, organizational philosophies, and I got all of these from the website for the National Associations of Music, Schools of Music. And those are resources that you can use so that you can frame your recommendations to get from the recommendations like we're getting from this conference to some kind of standard or guideline. When you review these published statements on the organization, you have to remember, though, that many, many kinds of organizations don't necessarily want the public to know what their founding principle is. And I put secret societies and crime syndicates down here, but you know any business is in business to make money. But if you read their mission statement, it doesn't mention making money. It mentions what they're going to do for their customers. If you want to see what they say about making money, then you have to look at their stockholder report. So you have to be a little careful. Sometimes it's not clear, really, what the true central passion of that organization is. So how do we go about kind of collecting what we need to know in order to get this process started? Well, the first thing you do is speak to the organization's founders, if they're still around, or review what they've written. And fortunately in PAMA, I have the benefit of knowing that most of the founders are still with us, and if I have a question, I can call them up and ask them, or email them. The other thing you have to do is you have to interview the membership, and that goes back to, you have to write this in a form that's going to be accepted by most of the membership. So you need to know where they stand. You need to review the published documents, because you're going to run into trouble if you propose something that flies in the face of something that's already published. It's not that that's impossible to deal with, it's just going to make it harder, and you need to understand that. Anyhow, from all these sources, you need to distill what is the central passion of the organization. You need to know that, because that is the key around which everything you're going to propose needs to revolve. And you need to articulate it in language that's most acceptable to the membership, which may or may not be so easy. The next step is to look for those related ideas in the search for the central passion. A constellation of attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs associated with and surrounding the central passion will have emerged. You need to look at each of those points, do the same thing you did with the central passion. You need to put it in language that will be accepted by the membership. And you need to clearly, in your own mind, make sure that it relates to that central passion as well. Same thing for behaviors. And in this time, you may search for behaviors that are counterproductive and say, we really need to make a statement that says, this is not a good behavior given what our central passion is. Or you need to say, this is really good behavior and we want to encourage it. But how you write that, again, needs to be clear. It needs to be clear to the membership. And as I said before, I believe that an ethical standard you should be able to tie that directly to one of the general standards, the behaviors, beliefs. you need to identify the nature of the organization and see if any specialized standards would apply, because you're not going to get very far unless you take those into account, and if they're not there, you may have to develop them. The example here that I gave was quality control standards. In a sense, an academic standard is a quality control standard, but I'm not sure it's exactly the same. I mean, quality control standards in the automotive industry are how many defects did you have in today's run? At the Toyota plant, part of their standard operating procedure was if you see a defect on the line, you stop the line right then and fix the defect, which is expensive in a car, in an operation that depends on everything being there just in time. If you stop the line in one spot at a Toyota plant, you stop the whole line. But if the company is committed to having no defects, that's what they did. I'm not sure they do it now, but back then, that's what they did. Identify any organizational processes that would benefit from being guided by experts. I think this conference has sort of done that and actually has already requested those guidances. The thing that needs to be understood is that you need to make sure you have all the expertises you need. So maybe it's not just healthcare providers and music educators. Maybe it's music administrators. We have some here, I agree that, but you need to make sure you've got all of the stakeholders included. So, because you need that person, that administrator, that stakeholder, to go out there and convince his fellows, his compatriots, that this is really what we ought to do. So you assemble those people together. In my recommendation, doesn't always happen, is that before you even start on the other standards and guidelines, you write a standard and guideline for creating these things. You write a procedure for arriving at what you're going to recommend as a standard or guideline. And in writing that, you can make sure then that what you're proposing is in line with the central passion of the organization and with the mind of the membership. Part of that 3-year process was what I'm calling a review process. In other words, I made a proposed policy, which actually was a standardized procedure, which is not quite the same as a standard. Toyota's standard was, we want to be as safe as possible. That was their standard. This was a guideline, but it was a pretty strict guideline because it was in the form of a policy. As far as I know, I'm the only non-Toyota person to produce a policy that was adopted without any change by Toyota. And again, I have to reiterate, in the final analysis, there are only 2 absolute requirements. One is that you have to address the central passion of the organization, and you have to do so in a manner that's accepted by the membership. Otherwise, it may get passed, but you'll end up with a standard or guideline that's not followed. So I'm done with my slides, except for this one, because I wanted to do a little exercise and see if we could come up as a group. This group, I've noticed from the answers when they put the questions on for general response, that this group has a central passion. Its central passion is, you all believe that there ought to be more awareness about health and the possible risks to it from what you do as music educators. That's pretty clear, because look at the responses we got. I'm not sure that if we had, you wouldn't have come to this conference if you didn't have something of that kind of conviction. I'm not sure if we just took a random sampling of music educators that we would have had the same numbers. We would have had some numbers, but we probably wouldn't have had the same number. So I'm going to ask us to pretend that we're an organization. The people in this room are an organization. And I have written down, and I'm going to ask you in a minute what you what you think about this. And the first question that we'll put up on the board is, you can read what I've said there. Do you think this would be the central passion of this group? Yes or no? You'll get a chance to answer that in a minute. Because if we don't agree on that, then we can't proceed to the next. We can't proceed to the next step. Can we just show a raise? I mean, okay, is that to show a raise of hands? I didn't give my fellow enough time to get this on. Oh. So anyhow, while he's doing this, oh, all right, okay. Yeah. How long do we give them to answer? Okay. All right, I'd be interested to know from the 10% who don't feel that that's the central passion, what their thoughts are about it. Does anybody want to volunteer? Actually, 90% is not bad. I mean, that would be enough to proceed, but and then the second question I'll ask for anybody, if you want to step up to the microphone, is are there other ideas around that, especially attitudes or understandings or as opposed to general health?
Yes, and it ties into some other things, I guess, that I've been hearing too and thinking about from this morning. I teach engineering students, and everything that I heard this morning on mental health could have easily applied to the engineering students, from performance anxiety and you name it. So the question is, I'm thinking about it more from the perspective of if you choose to be a musician, how have you increased your risks for certain things? And are we disclosing that and making people aware of those kinds of things? So that might be a little different than this more generic health awareness.
Okay, and I think that's valid. What would be your thought about making that, though, one of the general standards, since it is related to this more general concept?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. There's no limit on the number of general standards that you could have, but that is an attitude, that the issue is not so much general health, but it is what is the risk involved with this specific activity. I think that's fine.
One more comment, maybe. I guess what I would be concerned about is that this particular group, which deals primarily with music students, would be taking on too much in terms of thinking of general health, and maybe like deans or universities, if they want to start worrying about the general health of students, should take that on.
But understand, what I'm talking about is just finding out what are these things for the organization, because they're going to plug this concern they have into that organization at a level that I would call guidelines.
Gotcha.
But they can't do that without understanding what are the central ideas around the organization and how must it be articulated so that the membership understands it and accepts it, you know. And that can be a long process. And I guess my caution is, you're going, in your book, and each time you listen to one of the work groups, they're going to make some recommendations. But they need to be looked at. Those recommendations are made by experts who are not music educators. And they need to be looked at and placed into a context that only you can supply because you are the music educators. And you may need to go back to those experts and say, well, what exactly did you mean? Or would it be okay if we shifted it around? And that kind of stuff goes on all the time when in this kind of activity. I know very well because I've done it for a while. And you end up having to make adjustments, but you end up with something that is satisfying to both the experts and the general membership of the organization. So we would propose then, does anybody want to formulate that idea about specific risks related to music as a general, yes? Sure. How many would vote for that, not as the central passion, but as a general standard? I think that's. I think that if you look at what's come out in the organization, the concerns are risks, and they're not just performance risks, as it says in the handbook. It's health risks of all kinds. Should there be anything else? Well, I think safety is another one. And should there be anything else? I think there are probably, just listening to the group here, there are probably 5 or 6 general standards that could be added to what I listed as the central passion. That's pretty good. That's acceptable too. That's enough, a broad enough spectrum of the group, I feel, to have a chance of being accepted as a general standard. Let's take this one instead of looking at other general standards and see if you could imagine what a ethical standard might be related to this. We've actually had several questions about that. We had one yesterday, and I think that might serve us well. If we can repeat that one, if you know the measurement of the sound level in a band room, should the students be informed of that? If you know that it's risky, if you know it's above the risk for hearing loss, should they be informed of that? Now that'll be an ethics standard because informing the student or the parents is a behavior. That's something you actually do. It's not just an attitude, it's a behavior. I really like this gadget. 100%. Well, we know that one will fly. Okay, so let's use that example of an ethical standard and say, we want to develop, our proposal is going to be what should be our guidelines for that. And let's see. I think if you look at that step, that's the step that starts us on the road towards developing guidelines. Well, actually, it's not it. This is the step 5 here. Is this a process, an organizational process? And you might include in that, since we're talking about finding out that the noise levels in a room are too high, might include measuring that, might include analyzing it, might include informing whoever needs to be informed, including the institution. It might include, and a guideline might say, all of those things in any particular order or simultaneously or anything like that. Remember, the nature of guidelines is they can be in almost any form. The nature of teaching music is kind of a nonlinear process. I did a lot of policy guidelines for office functions, and they are nonlinear. It's very hard to put those into a flow chart or an algorithm. You really have to put them in something that is literary. But the question is, what do you need in order to create those things? What kinds of expertise do you need? Whose buy-in do you need? And then you start to think of then the practicality. The title of the thing is Passion and Practicality. The practicality is, if you want to get something like this adopted, you need to know how much it's going to cost. And the audiologists can shut their ears, but I know methods for doing hearing screening that are much cheaper than having to have a booth. The only thing is they don't meet the OSHA standards, but then they just told us that educational institutions don't fall under the OSHA standards, so you actually have a bit of freedom. But my audiometer is a handheld unit that cost about $2,300, and you could spend about $1,600 to train 2 technicians who are already your employee. It's a week-long course or something like that. And you could start a screening program with just that. All you need is to know that if you're you need a relatively quiet environment that's kind of consistently at the same noise level, you can use a dosimeter to actually measure that. Even if it's above the OSHA standard, at least you have a baseline. And you can measure it every year. If your student is in a high-risk sort of situation where there are rehearsals going on all day, or if it's an instructor who is teaching groups all day, it doesn't really matter if the baseline is a little bit high, because what you're looking for from year to year is a change. And if you see that, then you can send that person to the audiologist, who will have the sound booth and the sound-controlled room and stuff like that. But you don't need to maintain that at your site. All you need is a relatively quiet room and this little handheld audiometer and somebody who knows how to use it correctly. I do that in my own office. My office is not soundproofed. But what I tell the employers that use me is, I do this, and I have had a booth in the past, and I've actually compared people that I've tested in the booth to doing it this way, and there's been no change. As long as their discrimination is pretty good, they can tell what's background music and what's the tone coming from the audiometer. On the other hand, if somebody comes up with an abnormal result, well, I promise I will send them to the audiologist, and we'll get a real audiogram that does fall under the OSHA standard. And that's a fairly cheap way to do that, instead of spending $10,000 for a booth and another $20,000 to soundproof a room, or hiring somebody from the outside to haul a van onto the site and do this hearing testing for an ungodly amount of money. But you don't need all the fancy bells and whistles, as long as you understand what's the process, what the regulations are. In this case, there really aren't any. The only regulation is what makes sense in terms of measuring hearing. And then you can present it to a school and say, well, here's what it would cost you if you hired an off-site audiologist to do this, but we can do it for, look how much less it is. And my example of that is we convinced Toyota fairly quickly when we took over the medical management that they would save money if they put in $1 million physical therapy unit right at the plant. It was actually $1.2 million. They recouped that $1.2 million in 9 months because just in terms of measuring the lost time to ship them off somewhere else to get physical therapy. Just hours lost, not including the cost of the therapy. That's the kind of expertise you need when you're going to do a guideline like this, or at least when you're going to sell it to the organization. Anybody else think of any other things you need? What other kinds of expertise would you need to really write a guideline that you wanted to send to the National Association of Schools of Music and ask them to adopt? I mean, sound technicians should be able to measure the level of sound, but you need to know that. You need the justification for doing hearing in the first place is under some circumstances, the sound levels are at a dangerous level, and that presents a safety risk. The rationale there is a little specious because it takes time to develop a noise-induced sound loss or hearing loss. But ultimately, the reason OSHA puts that under safety is because they can't have workers stumbling around in an automotive plant if they can't hear the warning bells and buzzers and stuff like that. And of course, that's a much noisier atmosphere. Well, actually, it's not much noisier. That's the point. But it appears to be a much noisier atmosphere to most people. So you need to have those statistics back, that will help you sell the concept. And yes.
We have to be able to say to the director, thank you. Would we have to plan for alternative solutions if we don't measure up to the expectations? Let's say if the band hall is too loud, do we have to have something in place?
Well, I think that would be a good idea. I think that forestalls the questions. But understand that doesn't necessarily mean huge alterations to the band room. It might just mean rescheduling things. So that
well, you say just.
Well,
from a teacher's point of view, that is a big just.
Well,
and so how far does the organization go to deal with that? That is, I think, the problem with many of the questions here, that some of us think of public schools, others think of colleges, and the two environments are vastly different. And what is maybe possible in a college setting, even though I even doubt that there's much adjustment to a band hall possible, in public schools we're happy if we even have a room. So yes. How far does this organization go to take those issues into consideration? That's really my question.
But that's where that's the expertise that I can't supply, which is the expertise of the people that teach in these different environments. So you have to have somebody from each of those environments that knows the situation to help you form this more general standard, because understand, if you're going to propose this to the National Association, they have to cover all those bases. And so they're going to want to know the answer to that question, So already you've said we need the health expert, the audiology expert, we need somebody that understands cost containment, and we need somebody from each of the possible kinds of situations where this standard is going to apply.
It occurs to me at this point there's perhaps some expertise we need to communicate about the National Association of Schools of Music, and specifically what happens when we create guidelines or when NASM creates and establishes guidelines. I may not be the person to do that, but as somebody whose institution recently went through the reaccreditation process, I'm fairly fresh off of the 500-page document and whatnot. NASM is an accrediting body, so there are two things to take into consideration at minimum. One is, what are the things that we would want in place in order for music schools to be accredited. And it's quite possible that we don't want a specific decibel level to interfere with the accreditation of the Yale School of Music, the Cleveland Institute of Music, the Juilliard School. Or maybe it is, we do. Maybe we want to say, look, if your sound levels exceed a particular level, we will not accredit you because you're creating an environment that's not healthy. So that's a fairly hard line level, and I would urge caution in the number of recommendations that this body forwards that we specifically associate with accreditation, because it won't fly at the NASM meeting. It simply won't fly. That's not to say the recommendations that are already on paper aren't good ones, but there are perhaps recommendations that should be treated as just that, recommendations, suggestions to schools of music. Here's what you need to do in order to produce a healthy environment, but we're not going to cut you off at the knees if you don't do them. So I think it's very important to create at least those two categories, if not more, when we're thinking of what to actually forward, or these things will die on the way out.
That speaks to, you need to know the organization, and this organization is new to me. I just encountered it on the internet about a month ago because I knew I had to talk here. It also speaks to the fact that maybe the recommendations out of this kind of group should be given as guidelines. And I like the idea from the last group that, or from the last announcements, that a lot of you folks out there have developed programs that are working in your particular situation. That's a gold mine for guidelines as a model for other people to write similar guidelines that fit their situation. If you have enough of those, then you can extrapolate from that something a little more general that might go to the National Association and be adopted as a standard. Is it on?
Is this on? Hello? Oh, okay, thank you. One point, I think we have to clarify whether we're talking about the organization being the National School of Music, Association of Schools of Music, which is, I'm assuming it is, or whether we're talking about addressing standards K through 12, which would be MENC. And if we're, so I think we need to keep that straight when we're speaking. But right now, the guidelines that are in the NASM handbook are termed in terms of shoulds, which mean they're not required and nobody can lose their accreditation over them. So if we write guidelines and suggestions, they will be used as just that, or standards. The American String Teachers Association wrote standards for teacher preparation 7 years ago, which were accepted by NASM, but they're in an appendix as suggested guidelines at the back of the handbook. So it is possible to do that.
Thank you. I was going to say that my question to organizations like that, they've put these guidelines in an appendix. How do they know they're being followed? You know, as I say, what the purpose of my little talk was how to create guidelines that are actually used. And that's a whole major problem with standards and guidelines. And the only way that I can figure out to make that happen is to make everything that's written relate to these very basic, very central ideas and behaviors that are sanctioned by the organization, whatever that is. I mean, understand that your own school, your own organization, whether it's flute players or string players, whatever, will also have their own, that whole same set. So this is a way of looking at this kind of thing, whatever level you're at, just understanding that if you are a division of a larger organization, you have to be aware of what that larger organization is about, because everything you do has to somehow relate to what they're about.
What are your thoughts on basic dosimeter and audiometer training as part of teacher training? So let's say you're a teacher and you have a 1 hour, 2 hour rehearsal, and you know what the OSHA standards are, but then this way you can see if you're meeting or exceeding those standards.
that's not something that I would require, but I think those people that are interested in it should be allowed to pursue it and to publish what they learn. As we heard yesterday, the OSHA standard it ain't no great shakes. The NIOSH standard is much, much better. And so if you're gonna institute something like that, I'd use the NIOSH standard because it's much more protective, and I think it's better science behind it. I think there are problems with how you measure dosimetry in the situation that music teachers find themselves. You can do dosimetry two different ways. You can set the machine down in the room and measure what the noise levels are through a 24-hour period. That doesn't tell you, though, what the noise level is in the ear canal of the player who's got the violin right here. And so the better way, I think, for everybody involved in music is to stick the dosimeter where you're concerned about it, physiologically. So you put it right on the ear. You put it on the teacher, the band conductor that's conducting 7 different groups through the day, wears it on his lapel. So you know how much noise that person is getting, whether it's in the bathroom or in the band room. And if you're going to develop a guideline for that, then you need to take those things into account, and you need to find the expertise that will tell you that. Any other questions?
Yeah. Yeah, we're discussing setting standards, and we're discussing, for instance, the noise levels, and we're all in agreement that we want to make our students aware of these noise levels and the hazards. But if we don't impose the standards, then at some point down the line, we are into a liability problem. Because if you make the student aware that you're placing them in a hazardous environment or potentially hazardous environment, and you don't set the standard that forces the school to correct that, then the school is going to be sued at some point down the road. So at what point do we say, yes, this is the standard, and whether it's Juilliard or Eastman or Cleveland or any other school, this is the standard that we have to comply with?
I agree with what you're saying, and that's exactly the situation I had with, well, gee, I proposed a guideline and standard that said that, right now you don't fall under the OSHA standard, but if you do this, you're going to have 280 people that do fall under the standard, and you're going to have to follow all those strictures that come with an OSHA standard. And I think that kind of decision, though, happens in that 3 years where people mull this over and they decide finally, the final deciding thing is we want to keep our students safe. We don't want them losing their hearing. So we will institute a program. We will tell them if we feel that there is too much noise, and we'll institute a program to fix that, or at least to measure what's going on with the students. The interesting thing about OSHA standards is they often don't say that you have to fix it. They just say you have to develop a program that attempts to fix it.
Yes, Bill. Over the last couple of months, the music education group has been dialoguing, and they've offered me the opportunity to listen at times and provide some feedback. And one of the things that keeps coming back to me as a graduate student of that field, music education, being teacher training, is that the foundational principles, and I think those relate to this central passion, have been eloquently described for 150 years or so. And we've had some dialogue about this. And I've made the point that those principles, which seem to provide the argument for why we teach music, and it also provides some basis for what we teach about music and how we teach music, those principles seem to be void of any acknowledgement at all that there is risk inherent in the process of learning music, whether it's in an environment that's too loud or whether that you're assuming an incorrect posture when you're giving a student a horn or something. There's no acknowledgement in that central passion. And therefore, it seems to me that unless we address that, everything from that is less likely to change. like, for instance, getting the research journal to accept articles that deal with these issues, because currently they don't. It's not what music education does, and I think we can trace that all the way back to those foundational principles. Our graduate program at North Texas has not been willing to adopt an optional related field of study in music medicine, as have our DMA faculty and programs. So, because it's not what music education does. This is not part of our central passion. And correct me if I'm wrong, am I using the language appropriately?
Yes, that's the way I intended it, and briefly alluded to the fact that you may be wanting to propose a guideline or a standard that really hasn't previously been perceived as being part of that central passion. And that's a tougher situation. But you're not going to get anywhere with any proposal until you bring that out into discussion and resolve it. And that's where your conflict resolution skills and your use of logic and the argument that, you know, if we don't pay attention to this, sometime we're going to get sued, that all comes into that. So, anybody else?
Just a quick question.
Okay.
I'm just a little bit. NASM to ask all of their affiliated schools to adopt, or if we're petitioning NASM to ask some kind of musician wellness in the curriculum of every music student that graduates, because those are our futures, those are the people that are going to be going out working with the young students all the way up through geriatric people. You know, we want to make sure that they have the information to be able, we want to make sure that they have the information to go out and do a good job. And so my concern is maybe we should keep it more simple and just come up with one specific thing that we would like NASM to consider and adopt into their curriculum.
Actually, I would agree with that. I think it might not be one. I think it might be a small group of related ideas. But yeah, the simpler the better, and kind of the more general the better. At least you need to be sure that your proposal at that level covers most of the situations that it covers.
I just might mention that universities are struggling trying to incorporate everything that NASM already requires, world music and improvisation. And we can't add more courses to the curriculum because the students are already taking tons of hours. So to keep it as simple as possible and offer ways in which this information can be disseminated, whether it's through a pedagogy course or through the applied lessons, or how is that going to be handled?
Again, I think that you could make a recommendation about that, but if you could actually alter the awareness of everybody in the organization, bring it to their attention, this is important. It needs to be included in every class. Even if you're talking about music history or 18th century composition or something like that. And it could be incorporated. It's not undoable, it's doable. Other comments? I guess that's it. People are hungry. Thank you.